I approached my house going home that day, and I swear the thing that was going through my mind at that moment in time was that I was approaching the Amityville house. I went searching through every cabinet, through every pantry, through everything, looking for that man in the moon. After listening to this and being convinced that every band out there, from the Eagles to Jefferson Starship, were satanic, I left no stone unturned. Absolutely no quarter. Everything was on that bed, and out came the bat.
Welcome to Unbound,
a podcast for new atheists
and lifetime atheists,
ex-evangelicals,
truth seekers, and free thinkers.
There is life after faith.
And life here is good. It's time for a new perspective.
And a better conversation. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle. And it's time to get unbound.
I swear I did not do this on purpose. I really didn't. I had something else in the works for this week. And then just a few days ago, I said, I want to switch gears with this. I want to do something on the Satanic Panic. And then as I was sitting down to get things ready to record, it occurred to me that I waited for episode 13. So unlike the Friday the 13th thing where I posted our little mini-sode on Wicca, that was completely on purpose. This was completely by accident. I had something else that I wanted to do, and then I just said, I'm in the mood for this right now. I was going to try and save this for like October, do it closer to Halloween. We got so many other things we can do when we get closer to Halloween. It's not even funny.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to, I felt like it's something that I know a lot about and that I have some real interesting experiences to share about. And it was just more in my head than what I had originally planned for tonight. So here we are, episode 13, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Satanic Panic. But before that, since this entire episode is basically going to be about Christians behaving badly, I wanted to switch gears just a little bit at the beginning and talk about some of the other resources that are out there for anyone who is coming out of faith, thinking about coming out of faith, needs to feel better about coming out of faith, needs to learn what it's like living on the outside. Well, there are a bunch of podcasts that we enjoy, that Shelle and I really enjoy. And I'm going to hand her the mic and let her give you her little short list. And then I'm going to give you my short list. And the purpose of this is so that you have more resources, more things to pull from, more stories, more of everything that's going to help clarify things in your head a little bit more, that's going to help solidify some of the things that you already know or confirm some of the things that you think. And I don't consider any of these podcasts competition. I think that we are all on the same team. I think that it's important that we all support each other, and when there's good stuff out there, we should be talking about it. Right now, I'm going to hand the mic over to my co-host, and Shelle, tell us about some of your favorites.
Okay, well, the first thing you need to know is that all of mine are very lighthearted because I work as a data entry clerk. And I can listen to podcasts all day long, but concentrating on what I need to do and something deep would not work. So therefore, all of mine are mostly comic. The first one I have, which is probably also on Joe's list, is How to Heretic.
Oh, that's totally on my list. Number one.
Yes. Good advice on how to live your life after religion. I especially like the Graveyard of Gods, the Gods and Goddesses, where they discuss basically gods that nobody worships anymore.
I like their patron saint angle too.
Yes, I really like the patron saints that they create for their donors and the heaven that they create for any like large donors.
Yeah.
Their very own heaven.
Yeah, you see, we got to get a little bit more creative with the Patreon, I think. But let's attract some people for that first.
Yeah.
Wrong segment for that. Keep going.
Yeah, I really like how they deal with things. I like hearing their personal stories, and I find it very helpful for me. My next one is cognitive dissonance, which is a very snarky covers of news stories, a lot like our Christians behaving badly. They will cover news stories, and the hosts of that are Cecil and Tom. I enjoy it. I really like their Skeptics Creed that they recite at the end of every show. And they are also part of a charity drive that they do every year called Vulgarity for Charity. Everybody who contributes a certain amount gets a roast of the person of their choice, the person, place, or thing of their choice. They do that with the God Awful Movies guys. Another one is Thank God I'm an Atheist, with the hosts Dan from How to Heretic and Frank. They also cover news items, but they just have a little bit of a different spin. A lot of the news podcasts cover the same stories, but it's always fun to listen to everybody. I like them. They call their top donor every month their Lord and Savior.
That's perfect. I love it.
Yes, or like their Lord and Savior Adam, or their Lord and Savior Sean. I really enjoy God Awful Movies. Those sometimes I will just set the podcast to one I haven't listened to and just keep listening, because it will make my day just fly by, and also it's hilarious. I loved, we've talked about this before, but I loved their takedowns of the Thief in the Night series.
Oh, yeah.
It was just sort of getting all that crap out of my head, laughing at it and watching it blow away in the wind.
I've listened to all of those a couple
great.
of times now.
Yeah. I haven't listened to all of them, but I've listened to most of them. The Scathing Atheist, which is Noah, Heath, and Eli. They cover the news. Noah has a diatribe every week. I just really like his anger.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no illusions and anger go well together.
Yes, he's so good and he's so articulate about it. And I also like that his wife has a segment every week.
And it's that brand of righteous anger.
Yes.
That I relate to so well. I had first seen him on an episode of The Atheist Experience, and that was where I heard about God Awful Movies. And I just absolutely adore his delivery, his snark. You can tell the parts that really piss him off, but his delivery of it, I'm sorry, it is the definition of righteous anger. And the mix of that with humor really, really does drive a lot of those points home.
Yeah. Let's see. I also like The Friendly Atheist with Meta and his friend Jessica Blumke. I just really enjoy how they discuss all the news, and it seems like they've been friends for a long time, and it's always kind of nice to just listen to them discuss things. And, they both make a lot of sense. Meta also has another podcast out there called The Supreme Court versus Church-State Separation. Right now, there's only, I think, 4 or 5 episodes that discuss how the Pledge of Allegiance came to be and all of the court battles over including or not including it, or forcing people to say it or not say it, all the changes that have been made and when they were made and why they were made. And finally, The Thinking Atheist, where Seth Andrews basically just takes calls and discuss current events and other subjects. And I got a couple of outliers.
All right.
There's one called Citation Needed, which is the GAM guys and the cognitive dissonance guys read a Wikipedia article and become experts because it's the internet and that's how it works now. And it's usually pretty funny.
Cognitive dissonance. You see? Who can say that? Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. There we go.
And the GAM guys also do one more podcast called The Skeptocrat, which is basically their politics. their politics podcast, which is also pretty funny. And that's all I've got.
Okay. So you kind of touched on a couple of the ones that I like a lot. I mean, I pretty much figured that you and I were both going to come up with How to Heretic first.
Oh, yeah.
Especially good if you are an ex-Mormon, because they are very Mormon-centric in a lot of their commentary. But I've learned a lot through that, and also through another one of the shows on my list about Mormonism. And also the plethora of other topics that they cover, and every week everything that they put out just keeps getting better and meatier, and the chemistry between the guys that run that show is incredible. It's very easy to listen to them. They really do transform into your audio uncles and give you a good time, give you a good show every single time. Another one that I just actually discovered this week is one called The Life After. I think this one is closest in terms of the way that it presents its message. I think it's closest to what we're trying to do here. The conversation is always really, really interesting, and they have all kinds of guests on. They've done more networking to get more voices on their show than we have. I totally want to get more people to tell their stories here and do more interview type episodes as we go on, because sooner or later I'm going to run out of stories to tell about my experiences in evangelical Christianity. I mean, a lot of it was kind of mediocre and kind of just sort of cruising altitude. And I think that it's important for people to be able to tell their story and for other people to hear those stories, because there will always be loads and loads of points of relatability. And it just feels good to know that you're not alone. The Life After, given the few episodes that I've heard so far, it's been on in my car for the last 3 days straight, and I don't see any end in sight. I just keep looking through all the titles and just going to the stuff that I think sounds interesting, and I have not been disappointed. Their delivery is fantastic, and the people that they have on, there is real chemistry. There's just this real sense of solidarity, I guess, with the people that they talk to, and it's just a really, really good listen overall. Shelle talked about god-awful movies. Oh, please, if you are... if you're a new atheist or you're struggling with certain things about your faith, this is a great podcast to start listening to, because it will make you laugh and giggle and guffaw at all of these things that you thought were so serious before. And you'll hear things that are offensive. You'll hear things that are blasphemous, and your brain, it's going to tickle it a little bit now. And you get to just let it be tickled, because you know that they're making fun of fiction. And that's the best part of it, is that now you are looking at this from the outside and you can take the joke. I don't know about anybody else, but I didn't like that kind of joking about my Lord and Savior when I was drunk on the Kool-Aid all the time. But as soon as I got out and started looking at things like the Book of Mormon, not the Book of Mormon, the musical, the Book of Mormon. Let's be clear here. I didn't make any turns into Mormonism. The musical Book of Mormon was one that was popular around the time when I was having the second crisis of faith, and the stuff that was in there always stuck with me. Stuff stopped offending me so much after that. After listening to that soundtrack over and over again, there was a lot about that old life and people poking fun of it that just stopped mattering. So the more you put yourself in front of that kind of content, and the more used to the idea that you get about laughing about the crazy that you used to believe, the easier it gets to deal with. It's very good therapy, and I've talked about that before. Let's talk about the Atheist Experience. This is a live show every Sunday on YouTube, but they have a podcast version that you can download. I'm going to recommend this one with caution. If you are a struggling theist, you might find their delivery and their handling of some theist callers to be a little bit abrasive. That type of engagement doesn't happen with every caller. Even when there are disagreements, it just depends on where the conversation goes. It's just one of those things where they're kind of in their groove, and it might offend or intimidate, someone who is on the fence trying to get out of this. But at the end of the day, it's all good information. If you can just process it as information and not this big emotional thing, then great. But if you're not there yet, skip this one until you're a little bit more ready. But it's very, very good. Last podcast on the left. I'm going to talk about this one only because it's not within our strata. It's not about coming out of faith, but they have done so much work on so many different cults and religions, including Mormonism, including Jim Jones. The list goes on. So if you just look through all their episodes, you'll see numerous places where they expose all kind of theist ass hattery. It's a really good podcast. It's not about life on the outside, but you will learn a lot about cults and religions from the perspective of one of them. I know at least one of them is an ex-evangelical.
Yes.
So
Ben is.
Yes, Ben Kissel. He's an ex-evangelical, and he's got commentary all over the place. And you also get a lot of his story and a lot of his experiences, and it doesn't have to be on theistic topics. So that's why I want to include it here. I love his delivery. And also at the end of the series on Mormonism, one of the best closes that I've ever heard, and one of the best ways of helping people who are on the fence make that decision to get out. There's a great little monologue at the very end of that series that anyone who is struggling with getting out of any kind of evangelical religion really should listen to, because it's basically the anti-altar call.
Yeah.
It's okay to take your life back, and it's okay to be a little bit ashamed, and it's okay for this. And there's so many little things that he says at the end of that, and I love just listening to that part and taking it in for myself, because believe me, just because I run this podcast doesn't mean that I've got it all figured out. There are still things that I struggle with a lot. And knowing that there are other people out there that once thought that way and now think a little bit more in line with the way I think now, it's very helpful. And it helps me to keep going with this, knowing that what I'm saying may not be unique, but I do think that we say it in a very unique way. So last one on my list, and again, not necessarily about life on the outside, but if you are familiar with Adam Conover, he had this show, Adam Ruins Everything, and he does a couple of podcasts right now. And the one that I am listening to is one that is called Factually. This is a great podcast, kind of in the same vein as Adam Ruins Everything. It goes through all kinds of topics and shows where there are irrational thoughts, beliefs, whatever, things that we have been led to believe that aren't true, and says, hey, okay, so this is the way it really is. And he brings in some great guests to emphasize these points, and they have some really, really good stories to tell too. If you just look through the list of episodes, you will find that there are things in there, like the one that I listened to a couple of days ago, about why people cling to belief, why people believe things. And it's done from a completely secular standpoint. They never talk about faith at all, but it's kind of, this is how the brain is mapped for this. It is a great podcast if you want to start thinking a little bit more rationally and skeptically about certain things. For me, it helps me to keep my thinking aligned the way that it should be about pretty much anything. And he goes through, this is what people believe about this, but actually it's this way. And his stuff has always been an eye-opener to me, right back to the little Adam Ruins Everything snippets, 2-3 minutes at a time. But with this, you get an hour and a half worth, and it's meaty content. I've always loved his delivery. I've always loved the way he thinks about things. One of the better moments from him, I think, is a little thing. If you go to YouTube, this isn't about the podcast, but just go to YouTube and type in his name, Adam Conover. You are going to die. It's difficult to walk away from it and still be afraid of the concept, because he takes it and puts such a rational spin on it and says, hey, look, this is going to happen. it's time for you to start dealing with that fact. And fantastic little video. Just type in his name, Adam Conover. You are going to die, and you'll enjoy this. Especially if you're like me, and believe me, I still struggle with this one. I consider it a pep talk. I will watch this just to get a little bit of a pep talk and remind myself that, yeah, this is going to happen. Happens to everybody. You're here now, so get up off your ass and do something. Mm-hmm. That's it. Okay, so let's move along into our next little order of business here. Just want to take a couple of minutes to once again thank everyone who has been listening. We are on episode 13. I can't believe that we've made it this far already, and that we've got 13 episodes out there, plus that one little mini-sode that we did on Wicca. We got content out there, and people are consuming it, and we're seeing a lot of good response to what we're trying to do here. So once again, I'm going to take just about 30 seconds and just ask for you to just consider supporting us and what we are trying to do here, the improvements that we're trying to make. Our Patreon right now does not look all that enticing. I know we need some people to build things up so that we actually have things to offer. So if you think that this resource is worth $5 a month, that comes out to what, $1.25 an episode, something like that. If you think that the resource that we're producing here is worth at least that, then please consider just thumbing us $5 a month over on Patreon. Our links are on all of our content. You can click from the show description pretty much anywhere you hear podcasts, and just start making a little bit more of a difference. Start helping a few more people get and stay unbound from a religion that hates them and wants to keep them captive for the rest of their lives. And also all of the normal stuff that we always talk about. I'm Unbound_Spider on Twitter, and you are
Shelle Unbound.
No underscores, no nothing.
No nothing.
Just Shelle, Shelle, Unbound. And that's your handle on Twitter. We have our own Facebook group too. Just type in Unbound Podcast Network and we'll come up. Go ahead and like our page over there. And oh yeah, and also in the same thing. If you simply type in Unbound Podcast Network in YouTube, you're going to get to our channel there. And we need to bulk up some subscribers. We're getting a decent number of views on those videos for a channel with no subscribers, but we'll get further if more people subscribe. More people will see, things will rank a little bit better when people search for the content that we have out there. So just get over there and subscribe, hit the bell so that when new episodes hit, you know that they're there as well. Beyond that, talk about us. I've said it before. Word of mouth is one of the best ways to introduce people to new podcasts. So if you know anyone who might benefit from what we're doing here, simply tell them about it. Okay, so onward into our main topic. So being that it's episode 13, no, that has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with that. I just decided a few days ago that I wanted to switch gears and do something on the Satanic Panic. For whatever reason, it's been in my head quite a bit over, I'd say, the last 6 months or so. A lot of things have kind of cropped up in my mind, and I've been reminded of certain things that happened way back when. And some of the ways that these things affected me, I'll bet anything I'm not alone. Because, as I've said before, I was always too smart for this. But when you're in the thick of it and when you are drunk on that Kool-Aid, all kinds of things that don't make any sense whatsoever start making sense. And that is what things like the Satanic Panic are built on. Let's talk about, just for a minute, the original Satanic Panic, the Salem witch trials of 1692. Mm-hmm. So it was basically the same thing. A few people got whipped into a frenzy about something, just blew it completely out of proportion, and a bunch of people and 2 dogs died. Mm-hmm. It was just unbelievable. And that was in 1692. Fast forward to like the late 70s and going into the early 80s, and we discover that we really haven't learned jack Q shit about this. No. Because there were other things in between, and some a little bit more secular than others. I think a lot of people tied the McCarthy hearings into the same kind of hysteria. But satanic panic is not something that only happened once. It really is kind of an ongoing thing. It's just that there were a few years there where all of this shit just built to a crescendo. And it started with a few pop culture lead-ins that went back as early as the early 70s. You had movies like Rosemary's Baby. You had the Amityville Horror. You had The Exorcist. This started putting these kinds of dark themes into the cultural mindset. They became part of the zeitgeist. There were a lot of those devil movies in the 70s, really, really badly produced, and actually started like in the 60s. I would kind of lump in some of the Hammer movies with that. They were kind of precursory. They did have some supernatural themes, but they didn't have the out-and-out satanic themes that some of these movies had in the 70s. It didn't seem like people cared too much about it back then. It was just kind of, it was niche entertainment. There were people that liked it and people who didn't, and the people who did consume the content, the people who didn't just really didn't talk much about it. Something started happening when we got a little bit further into the late 70s, early 80s. I think some of it started with Son of Sam, where there was the whole supernatural aspect of him hearing voices from his dog. But most of what spurred this on, there were a few very specific things that happened over the course of just a couple of years that really led to a widespread panic. And it went way beyond your neighborhood evangelical church. We're talking about things that had impact on a huge portion of American society during that time. Just to give a quick outline, we're going to go through all of these with a little bit more depth, but the key players here were incidents like the McMartin preschool debacle, Ricky Casso and Sean Sellers murders. You had the whole thing with Procter and Gamble. And later on, just a few years later, or actually, no, it wasn't even a few years later. This was around the same time. This was all on the same basic timeline where you had the whole hysteria about backward masking that built to a crescendo, starting with the Peters brothers and then guys like Gary Greenwald and Joe Vieira. We'll talk about these guys in a little bit. And also, let's not forget about Bob Larson. We'll talk about him a little bit later, too. But let's try and establish a little bit of a timeline here. One of the earliest things that really spurred on the satanic panic was the McMartin preschool case. Now, I wasn't even aware that this was still going on when I was in college. It had kind of faded from the public eye, and I hadn't heard anything about it in quite a while, but I also hadn't heard any resolution to it. Now, of course, we're talking about a time when there was no internet. There was mass communication, obviously, but there was no internet. It wasn't instant. We're talking about a time in history when the news was still the news, okay? You didn't have the 24-hour news cycle yet. So when these things were happening, we were at the very beginning, I think, of that whole 24-hour news cycle thing. And that was, I think that might have actually been why some of this stuff got more play than average. But even so, I can remember early on, very early in this whole thing with the McMartin preschool, I can remember seeing things on the news. They covered parts of the trial. The timeline is fuzzy in my head. I know that I was young and it didn't really mean that much to me yet. So I do believe that the first time that I saw anything about this was before Word of Life, because I would have chunked a lot more in with it if I had already had the evangelical stuff pumping through my brain. So I don't think I had yet. It was just one of those things where I had heard about this case. Kids had been abused, and there was something about satanic rituals. I found a really good summary about this from a New York Times article that was written by Margaret Talbot. This was, I believe, late 80s. I can double check that. It's going to be in the show notes anyway. But it's from an article called The Devil in the Nursery by Margaret Talbot. And she summarizes the whole thing really, really well in just a couple of sentences here. She says, when you once believed something that now strikes you as absurd, even unhinged, it can almost be impossible to summon that feeling of credulity again. Maybe that's why it is easier for most of us to forget rather than to try and explain the satanic abuse scare that gripped this country in the early 80s, the myth that devil worshippers had set up shop in our daycare centers, where their clever adepts were raping and sodomizing children, practicing ritual sacrifice, shedding their clothes, drinking blood, and eating feces, all unnoticed by parents, neighbors, and authorities. Let's not forget about the tunnels, the secret tunnels that were supposed to be all over this property. The way that it escalated was just, it was crazy. And I'm sorry, but I've seen this before, and I've seen it in many evangelical circles. It's just a form of gaslighting.
Yeah.
These kids were told that things happened, and were probably told things in words that they had no way of understanding. And it started manufacturing memories. This is something that happens, especially when you're looking for something or you are under stress and you are trying to align memories in a certain way. Well, your brain has a way of skewing what those memories look like. Our brains aren't that efficient in remembering things long term, especially when you're a child and you've got adults in your life that are telling you that this is the way something is. It just sort of follows you. This is what is believed to have happened here. But there was never any kind of evidence of any kind of ritual abuse. They never found those stupid tunnels because they didn't exist. And after years and years of the longest and most expensive, or one of the longest and most expensive trials in American history, they basically wind up at square one with everyone acquitted of everything.
Yeah.
So it accomplished absolutely nothing except traumatizing a bunch of people and children, which is the worst part of it. Yeah. But it's just crazy to me that even in a world that didn't have social media tainting the news, that all of this stuff just came out. I'm a big fan of Kurt Vonnegut. So anyone who's ever read the book Breakfast of Champions knows what I'm about to bring up, with the whole thing with Kilgore Trout and him getting mugged, and he didn't see who did it. And when the cops asked him who was it that did it, he responded in pure Kilgore Trout style. He's like, I have no idea. I never saw him. It could have been an intelligent gas from Pluto, which then spiraled into this whole thing about a Pluto gang that was overrunning the city and the panic that it created. And it was all just so hauntingly reminiscent of the Satanic Panic, but also the Salem witch trials. And that was the general message of that passage. Vonnegut had a way of explaining things and kind of confronting us with our own stupid that really, and again, as a new atheist, you should be reading some Kurt Vonnegut. I'm sure that your pastor would have not wanted you reading Kurt Vonnegut, but pick up whatever you can from him and just read it. Okay, then end of plug. So we're talking about the McMartin preschool. There were other things that kind of kept things churning with this and led into the bigger stuff. The Ricky Casso and Sean Sellers murders, just to give a brief overview of each of these. Ricky Casso, also known as the Acid King, and the subject of more than a couple of songs over the years, he murdered Gary Lauwers. And the thing that ties into the Satanic Panic with this is that according to a bunch of sources, Casso was an occult enthusiast. In other words, he had an interest in this stuff. The more I heard about this back in the day, the more it seemed like there were things being added over time. And one of my friends at the time was really, really into the book Say You Love Satan, which was supposed to be a biographical retelling of what happened, but what it really was a very disjointed narrative that had some basis in fact, but was mostly fiction. But because this was something that was in the news, and because of the way that the book was presented, a lot of people believed that what they were reading in the book was actually true. And that was very problematic because it just started spurring on this thought process that began, I believe, with the McMartin preschool And then you have these two murder cases sandwiched right together. You've got Ricky Casso, who killed Gary Lauwers, and then you've got Sean Sellers, who killed his parents in what he said at the time was in response to, I believe it was that the devil made him do it.
Yeah.
That he had been practicing Satanism and he had gone off his rails. That was his excuse at the time. He conveniently accepted Christ and became a born-again Christian when he was in prison and basically built a career out of his story until he was finally executed in 1999. So, and when that happened, it was such a non-issue in the public eye anymore that it went unnoticed by me for quite a while. I never saw anything in the news about it until maybe 6 months or so later. And I saw an interview with a couple of the other family members who had described him as being, I think the words that they said were arrogant to the very end. I'm sorry, but if the shoe fits, that evangelical thinking gets in there deep, and it does do a lot to taint the way that you think about yourself and the way that you present your ideas. And I'm talking about ideas on anything. So I can remember with the Sean Sellers case that the real issue that they had was that he used his last words to spew more evangelical bullshit. That was pretty much it. So do you have anything that you want to jump in on with this yet?
I just wanted to say that one of the things that kicked off the Satanic Panic was the publication of the book Shelle Remembers, which was in 1980. And McMartin occurred in 83.
Right.
Right. So the Shelle Remembers book was like kind of a big thing. I hadn't read that one, but I did read Satan's Underground. Shelle Remembers was written by Michelle Smith and her husband, the psychiatrist Lawrence Pazder. It was written in the form of an autobiography. So she was an adult. She purported that there were all sorts of things that happened to her in conjunction with satanic cults. It's all been discredited. Just like Lauren Stratton's book, The Satanic Underground.
Yep.
Satan's Underground. That's what it was
Satan's
called.
Underground. And that one pissed me off because that was one that I read and it freaked me out.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah. All those things freaked me out because, they built this whole secret society of Satanists having breeder women to give birth to babies for their rituals. And it's like, really?
There was so much of that, though. And it was allowed and it was encouraged because there were even rumors about a satanic cult right outside of my hometown.
Oh, yeah.
And where they used to meet and what they used to do. And I remember actually writing something for our youth group newsletter about this, and it was just accepted as truth.
Oh, sure.
It was crazy how it was just accepted as truth and that we needed to pray for these people and all. It was nuts.
It was all urban legend.
It was urban legend, but it was also just, it was people either caught up in their hysteria or just bored and wanting attention, because that's really where a lot of this comes from. You have something interesting to say and then all of a sudden people are listening to you.
Yeah.
And that, I think, had a lot more to do with it because there were so many little things that cropped up during that time, and some even bigger things. You were talking about people who gave fraudulent accounts of the types of things that they went through. Let's talk for a second about Mike fucking Warnke.
Oh, God.
I don't know of anything from that part of my life that pissed me off more than that.
Oh, I was angry about that one.
Now, the thing is, I was angry about it at the time when that Cornerstone article came out. I was angry about it then, mostly because I was so convinced that all of this stuff was real. Right. That if there was this crackpot out there making shit up, that it was just going to detract from the real problem. It pissed me off then for that reason. Today, it just pisses me off because of the timing and structure of it, how he used it, and how good he was at manipulating people. Because he had a very trustworthy way of delivering this message. He was a very good liar. And all of the stuff that he talked about was right in lockstep with the things that people were kind of looking over their shoulder for during the Satanic Panic. So he knew how to frame this story. He knew how to frame himself in the story. And he knew precisely what details were going to be hot buttons, especially for evangelicals.
Yeah.
And he really capitalized on that. So as if the stuff that was actually happening in the real world wasn't enough, now we've got these crackpots writing books and going out on tours as Christian comedians. Mike Warnke was a Christian comedian.
Yes.
So he would soften you up with jokes and then start telling you all this shit about the stuff that he used to do, which he never did. Mm-hmm. And there were many, many, many examples of that. All kinds of traveling preachers and speakers. We saw several of them come through the youth group. And it just, there was a similarity to so much of it that after a while, even I, completely mired in the Kool-Aid at that point, looked at it and said, okay, these people are copycats. They're just trying to make some money on the heels of this. So after we watched the third or fourth video and then had the third or fourth speaker come in for a youth group event, it started meaning a little bit less to me from that source, but there were plenty of other things that scared the living shit out of me and really, really traumatized me. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. Oh, and incidentally, the Say You Love Satan book that had everyone believing that all of that business with Ricky Casso was true. It's not even in print anymore. This one was kind of small potatoes. Fewer people knew about it, and it wound up circulating more in evangelical circles because of, well, for starters, because of the time, but also because of the way that the story is presented in the book. It's a secular book, but there's definitely an evangelical slant, or at least it tells the story in a way that would appeal to an evangelical audience. I'll put it that way. But there were things with Ricky Casso too, and all the others that were true and verifiable with certain dabblings in Satanism and the occult. And before I go any further with that, let's just make sure that people are clear on what Satanism is and what it isn't, okay? For starters, I said before that if I were to go back to any kind of a religion, I would probably choose Wicca, mostly because of its honesty and its non-insistence on following certain deities and certain rules and certain holy books and all of that. There's none of that. Well, there's none of that in Satanism either. But the Satanism that you saw in the footage from Anton LaVey's Satanic Temple and what actual Satanists are about, well, there are similarities and there are differences. Satanism and hedonism are very, very closely tied. And most Satanists will tell you that Satan is not a proper name, that it is a concept. The vast majority of the ones that I know and have interacted with have actually been atheists. So Satanism helps you get a little bit more in touch with your hedonistic side, your more animalistic side. It's kind of a no rules, no holds barred kind of thing that is designed to basically let you be you and fuck everybody else. That's pretty much it. It has nothing to do with what you see in the old devil movies and whatnot. Any modern Satanist will tell you that there really isn't a whole hell of a lot to what you see in popular media. And what happens and as part of that religion is a lot different than what you would probably expect. So there isn't the kind of hocus pocus that would have to be involved in some of the stuff that we're going to talk about next to be able to even be attributed to any kind of Satanist cult, any quote unquote real Satanist cult. So most of it came right out of people's imaginations, just like the Salem witch trials. We've learned nothing, and it's kind of sad. The next big thing that I can remember with this is the whole thing with Procter and Gamble. Now, I'm going to spend a little while on this one because this, if you want to know about one of the things that really, really attributed to my religious trauma, this was it. Okay? Let's talk just for a second about a little concept called the Mandela effect. There are people out there who will swear on a stack of Stephen King novels that they remember watching the president of Procter and Gamble sit down for a conversation with Phil Donahue, where he admitted that his company supports the Church of Satan, blah, 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 satanic this and satanic that. There are people out there that will tell you they saw it with their own two eyes. Only one problem. It never happened. Okay? Just like there are people out there that will tell you that they watched with their own two eyes in the late 80s Nelson Mandela's funeral in South Africa. Well, no, he didn't die in the late 80s. And he didn't die in prison. So, no, that didn't happen either. And there are so many examples of this. You got your Berenstein versus your Berenstain Bears. That's the next one that comes to mind. I'm sure there will be more as we go, but you get the idea. If you've heard of this before, then you know what I'm talking about. This is just another one of those things. It flat out didn't happen, but there were people out there that just couldn't leave well enough alone with this. There had been a few accusations early on about their logo and some of the imagery in the logo. It wasn't until the early 1980s when a pastor named Jim Peters, I saw that look, and he wasn't even one of them. That's the funny part.
God.
There was a pastor by the name of Jim Peters that kind of picked up the ball and ran with this and tried to show that the eons old logo for Procter & Gamble was somehow a satanic symbol, and went through all kinds of reasons why. So the guy that started all of this was the brother of Dan and Steve Peters, a.k.a. the Peters Brothers. And what an appropriate fucking name that is.
Yeah.
They were a couple of Peters, all right. But, back in the day, I traveled to see them twice. And reasonably far from campus, too. 2 different places in Pennsylvania over 2 years. I actually went to see these guys. And it was the same old both times.
Well, yeah.
They are such... I don't know if they're still out there or not. I don't even care to look them up at this point. But back then, they were such one-trick ponies that their messaging never changed. The examples never changed. They never expanded on anything. They never updated anything. It was just the same shit, different year every single time you saw them. And I'll take that back, because there were a couple of times where I think that they did try to keep perpetuating the backward masking thing with some more modern music. And they say, well, this is still happening and blah, blah, blah. But the time for it was over at that point. So I think they did try to add on a little bit as they went, but not by much. It was basically the same every single time. The whole thing with the Procter & Gamble business goes back to an article that appeared in the Minneapolis Tribune in March of 1980 called Rumor Giving Company a Devil of a Time. And it was about rumors that had been sparked about the logo. Here's a quick quote from that article. It was first developed by wharf hands to mark Star Candle crate boxes. That's what the logo was for. And then the company eventually decided to formalize it, created the graphic with 13 stars that represent the 13 original American colonies. No, has nothing to do with the unlucky number 13. It's just that we had 13 colonies when we started. And the number 13 shows up a lot in all kinds of imagery. In our flag, in our money, it's all over the place. So it was popular to use groups of 13 to symbolize America at that point. So in 1882, they trademarked that logo. It was actually the logo that was created later in 1930. The original one didn't have a lot of the imagery that people were upset about. It was the new one that was created in 1930 that sparked all of that panic. But the funny thing is, it took about 50 years, because this was 1930. It was the 1980s when people launched after Procter & Gamble with full force. As a young evangelical kid, this stuff started churning up again. I want to say it had to be around 1986. I'm pretty sure that that's also the time that I ditched secular music for a long time, because a couple of things happened. It was the Procter & Gamble thing, and it was the backward masking thing that had me in a complete tizzy. So let's stay on the timeline. Let's talk about Procter & Gamble. So all of this panic got itself an upsurge, probably around 85, 80. It was later. It was 86-ish, because I had already been kind of established. I was already a Christian, but I was young, and I was very, very impressionable. I'd always had questions and concerns, and I was always a little bit skeptical about the things that I believed. And that made all of this that much more intimidating, because all of a sudden I had something that really honestly looked real and looked like a real threat. You seeing something over there? You want to add something?
The company received unwanted media publicity in the 1980s due to rumors spread largely by Amway distributors that the moon and stars logo was a satanic symbol.
So that's where it started.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. We talked about MLM in the last episode too, or a couple episodes back. It's still on the back burner. Yeah. There's so much that you can do, especially with that company. Oh, that doesn't surprise me in the least.
Nope.
But you know what? I'd never heard that before. What's the source of that? I want to make sure that's
okay,
legit.
This is Wikipedia.
Okay.
Let's see.
Is there a source article down there?
The information is from the Chicago Tribune, April 25th, 1985.
Wow. So it's actually legit. You see, when I see 1985, I'm thinking, okay, this is something that didn't manage to get tainted by social media just yet. Yeah. So when it's a source like the Chicago Tribune, I can trust it. Yeah. So yeah, that's weird that I'd never heard that. But then again, Amway wasn't really in my crosshairs back then either.
No.
So there could have been something about it, and I just sort of heard it, and it went in one ear and out the other. But that kind of, I was today years old when I realized, when I found that out. Okay, that's good. That was a good find. But regardless of where it started, the panic that ensued, and some of the things that some of my friends and I started talking about, and one of my friends in particular who I loved and adored, he was in my wedding and all of that. But I'll tell you what, he put a worm in my ear that just would not go away over all of this stuff. And I remember we were sitting there at lunch one day at school, and he says something along the lines of, "We've all allowed Satan to move into our houses." And it sent chills. You know, you get those hairs that stand up on the back of your neck, and those words just, they didn't leave me. I approached my house going home that day, and I swear the thing that was going through my mind at that moment in time was that I was approaching the Amityville house. It had that kind of ominous foreboding about it, and it was still my house. But now it looked like the devil's house because these products were in there. And I went searching through every cabinet, through every pantry, through everything, looking for that man in the moon. And every single time I saw it, I felt like what I was touching was unclean. And I felt like Satan was in the room with me. And I felt like my entire home had been taken over by this evil. And in my head, I could see this black tarry muck all over everything. Satan had moved in, and he was not leaving. It was at the point where if I woke up in the middle of the night needing to go to the bathroom, I thought twice about it. I didn't want to walk out my door and look down the hallway and have Satan waiting for me. Because Satan lived in my house now.
Oh, boy.
This is what I was going through. And it got so bad, and it didn't take long. It got so bad that my mother and I literally went around, and she believed this too. We went around and found every Procter & Gamble product in the house, put it in a box, and got rid of it. But I still found stuff. There were things that we missed. And it was like the devil was just playing with me. Satan was just playing with me. There was always going to be something. There was always going to be a reminder. There was always going to be a reminder that Satan lived in my house. I could not get that phrase out of my head. And it plagued me because everything right down to the detergent that was used to clean the sheets that I was sleeping in, I'm wrapped up in Satan right now. Oh. It was that bad. My little, whatever old mind it was, 14, 15 years old, heard all of this, started seeing that logo everywhere. And some of it was the placement, because in some of these products, for whatever reason, they had that little logo on the back of the label, and you could only see it if you looked through through the container.
Right.
And I can remember my mother being really upset by one part of this, where Ivory soap was a Procter and Gamble product. And I can remember her taking the Ivory soap and putting it in that box and saying, "This is supposed to be the symbol of purity." And that was their slogan for a while.
Oh, yeah.
And it hit me even harder. The lies and the deception. And that's what Satan is. He's a liar. And I'd been told that so many times in youth group meetings, in church services, in sermons. Satan is a liar. Satan is a liar. The symbol of purity. Well, Satan lives in your house. I was afraid to eat something with a fork that had been washed with Dawn. I literally would lift a fork to my mouth and it's like, what was this washed with? Because it's probably unclean. And who at that age deserves to think about anything on that level? Getting all of that stuff out and still finding stuff over time was extremely difficult. And it was always a point of paranoia for me. And my mother started being very careful about what we were buying. Now, after a little while, it did come out that this was nothing but a big hoax. And being that this was several years after the initial accusations had been made, it was a little bit easier to swallow when they came back and said, yeah, you know what? There's really nothing to this. This is just a revamping of a story from a few years ago. You don't really need to worry about it. But I'm sorry, I was already worried. And it was weeks in between. So for that time, I was literally looking over my shoulder, living in my own house, and afraid to do anything. I didn't even want to sleep in the bed because the sheets had been washed in detergent that was made by Procter and Gamble. So that was the effect that it had just on me. And I wasn't the only one. Now, I don't know if all of my friends got it as bad as I did, but I know that there were other of my friends that were equally disturbed and upset that those things were in their house and that their parents had been duped into buying them. I kept a lot of what was going on in my head to myself back then. I didn't tell people the real honest to God fears that were going on in my head at that point. But when I heard other people talking, I could hear it in their voices. This was a major point of fear for a lot of people. And I don't know about anybody else's youth group or anybody else's youth ministry, but I know that the evangelical groups that I was part of absolutely positively did their level best to capitalize on that and what comes next. Let's talk about a little thing called backward masking. Okay. So when the whole Procter and Gamble thing reached a crescendo in my head, we went through the house and got rid of all things Procter and Gamble. Well, a couple of years later, I want to say, well, not even a couple of years later, a lot of this stuff happened right on the heels of each other. I want to say this was around 1986 when I was introduced to a little tape series called Rockabye Bye Baby by Pastor Gary Greenwald. This is still out there. You can find it. There's parts of it that are missing that I can't find anywhere, but 3 out of 4 of these files are on SoundCloud. And more than enough. I'll link to those 2 in the show notes, but just listen to this crackpot for about 10 or 15 seconds and you're going to have enough. I must have listened to this entire series 20 times and had most of what was going to be said when memorized. I had listened to it so much. And the end result of that was me getting rid of a lot of music that I really liked, and I'll get to that part of it in a minute. But the very first thing that I had heard about backward masking was the whole thing with Stairway to Heaven. Now, Stairway to Heaven is near and dear to my heart because Stairway to Heaven came out about the same time I did, early November of 1971. So, and I had known that, which made what happened next kind of hard to swallow. I had heard about this story with someone playing Stairway to Heaven backwards and there being devil messages, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It was going to be a little bit later when all of this stuff would start really coming to the surface. The Peters brothers were pioneers with this, but they, in my opinion, didn't do it anywhere near as well as Gary Greenwald did, complete with an entire section at the end that describes hell and why you really want to show up next week with all of your devil records so that we can burn them. And that was the messaging there. That was what he wanted to have happen. And he even gives a call to action toward the end of the presentation for people to do this, to bring their secular music, and they were just going to build a big bonfire and burn all their secular music. Well, I didn't have access to a bonfire, but I did have access to a Louisville Slugger. And after listening to this and being convinced that every band out there, from the Eagles to Jefferson Starship, were satanic, I left no stone unturned. Absolutely no quarter. Everything was on that bed, and out came the bat. And I must have smashed for a half hour straight. And I felt like I had won something. I felt like I had really won a victory here, that this stuff was out of my life. It couldn't hurt me. And there's no more Satan in this house. Because remember how crazy I went over the Procter & Gamble stuff. It really did start to build up again with the backward masking stuff. I couldn't stand that this stuff was in the house. So I went through and Hulk smashed everything and put everything in a big bag, brought it out to the curb, saying, "Thank you, Jesus, for showing me what this is and showing me the truth of what it is." And I don't know how much money or how many good albums were sacrificed in that, but it was a lot. It was a lot. And it's something that I regret. Now, a lot of those tapes I probably wouldn't be able to use anymore, but there was some very, very, very nice vinyl that just went kaplooey because my brain did over this. And it's the same kind of panicked thinking that causes people to grab a neighborhood dog and string it up and hang it. Because that happened in Salem.
Yeah.
Okay? It's that level of crazy that makes a 15-year-old run around his house proclaiming that Satan lives in my house. You've got to be able to see the signs, and you've got to understand what whipping up this kind of a panic can actually do. I was just a kid who managed to get duped not once but twice in a very, very short period of time over this kind of hysteria. And it had everything to do with the way that it was presented and the tone in which it was presented. Very, very appealing to the average evangelical, because I don't know anyone in my little circle that didn't believe that all of this was true. And honestly, I'm going to go on record with some of this stuff. I don't know how to explain it, but I do know that there are certain things that go into backward masking that are very easy to explain. I took it upon myself to try the whole thing with Stairway to Heaven, but I did it high-tech style. I didn't use a vinyl record. I just took an MP3 and ran it through Adobe Audition and played it backwards.
Yeah.
It works. The stuff that they say is in there from a certain perspective, if you listen really hard, like the song says, then you can actually hear something that sounds like they're saying what they say it's supposed to say. The clarity of it was and is still a little bit unnerving, but I also understand how phonics works. And I also understand that when you turn phonics inside out, all kinds of crazy shit can happen. So we're talking about backwards phonetic sounds that sort of kind of sound like forwards phonetic sounds of other words. And that's really all that you're hearing there. And it just so happens that the commingling of these words with maybe a kick drum or something on a guitar that sort of slurs it a little bit as you go by can make it sound like it's saying something that it's not. So since I'm already making this point, let me just run with it a little bit. The whole thing on backward masking relies on you being just impressionable enough that if somebody tells you, okay, I'm going to play this clip from this song forward, and then I'm going to play it backwards, and here's what you're going to hear. If you're capable of just hearing it, then of course you're going to fall for this hook, line, and sinker. Okay? But here's the thing. I can play any song backwards, and I can sit there and I can listen, and eventually I'm going to come up with something that sort of kind of sounds like something else. It's something that you can do with anything. And now I'm going to play this song backwards for you. And I'm going to tell you ahead of time what it is that you're supposed to hear. Of course, you're going to hear it. Now I'm going to take another song, and I'm just going to play it backwards for you. I'm going to ask you what you think you hear. You're going to tell me that you hear gobbledygook. But when I take the same snippet of a song and play it backwards for you and tell you, okay, now this time I want you listening closely because I think that you're going to hear it this. And what happens? You hear it, right? Mm-hmm. Because now your brain is trying to find that thing. Your brain thinks that there is something there for you to find, and it's going to try to find it. Okay? Just like when I was in Wicca, and I found it remarkable that anytime I looked at trees, I could almost always see the face of the green man.
Right.
There's a reason for that. Our brains are wired to look for the shape of faces.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's not anything mystical or magical. It doesn't mean that there are deities living in the trees. It means that my brain is doing what it's supposed to do. And it's seeking out something that's more like me. Our brains are wired to look for those details. So when you go looking for them, you're going to find them. And it works that way with anything. So when you start wiring your brain to hear details in songs that you play backwards, all of a sudden you're hearing it. Some of the examples that Gary Greenwald cited in this, and I'm sorry, pretty much everything that he cited, it's the framework for all of it. This very small collection of songs really is the framework for most of it. He borrowed from the Peters brothers, who borrowed from him, and all of a sudden there's just this group of songs like Hotel California, like Another One Bites the Dust, Stairway to Heaven. There were a couple of others that allegedly had backwards messages in them. The one that I found the most sinister was when he starts talking about Hotel California. Now, Pastor Gary Greenwald wanted us to believe that this song was about the incorporation of the Church of Satan. Well, when I listen to that song, I'm not hearing anything about satanic ritual. What I'm hearing is a song about the downward spiral into drug addiction. Okay? Up ahead in the distance, he sees a shimmering light. He gets to the doorway, and there's this beautiful woman. Of course, vices are supposed to be beautiful. She lights up a candle to heat up the spoon and shows him the way. That is what that song is about. At least in my head, that's what it's about. And ask Don Henley if it's anything different. I've always equated this song with the consequences of drug addiction. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Once you're caught in that cycle of addiction, it's very, very hard to break free. And when you're stuck in that place, especially with heroin, it can be a very, very difficult place to get out of. And there are different interpretations of that song. Gary Greenwald's was bullshit. Pure and simple. Yeah. It fit with his messaging. And then he goes into this whole thing where now we're going to listen to the song backwards. And let me tell you, some of the biggest reaches and stretches in this entire thing happen in this song. There are supposed to be all kinds of things that you can hear. Even back in the day, even being told to listen for it, I listened to that particular song and said, this is a real stretch here.
Yeah.
But it was one of those moments that just sort of stuck in there. What did we learn when we were in school about true-false tests? If any part of the statement is in any way, shape, or form false, then the entire statement is false.
Right.
So when you start making false claims about backwards messages in music because now you want a good tie-in to this bullshit story about what the song is supposed to be about, which it really isn't about. So basically what happened when he went after Hotel California Now, it wasn't just a matter of I liked the song. I was actually freaked out by the song after that because it's still stuck in my head, even though I knew that my rational mind knew that this was a big reach, but it's still stuck in my head because at that time, that was what my brain wanted to do with that information. So at that point, it was enough of a brain worm for it to never completely settle in. Because if you have to embellish, and it's the same problem that I had with the movie Zeitgeist, right. If you have to embellish to make your point, then do you really have one? There are so many more true examples of things happening out there that are part of what people would consider to be real satanic influence. Why are we manufacturing shit about playing music backwards? Okay? Because it got a lot of people's attention. There are people who still believe wholeheartedly that this is something that happens, still happens, and that you can observe it. But it's just more of the same old, same old. You tell me I'm going to hear this, and I'll sort of kind of hear it, you know? Yeah. Lay down on the ground, look at the clouds, and say, look at the bunny. And all of a sudden, everybody sees a bunny. Mm-hmm. Who saw the bunny before? You know, it's the same exact thing. But there were other players in this. We had a guy that was very popular in our part of New York who did a similar seminar on this, and he spaced it over several days. His name was Joe Vieira. I don't know if he's still out there either. I've heard his name recently. I don't know what he's doing, but he was one of the Peters Brothers copycats. And again, a lot of the same stuff, the same framework of songs, and the same way of explaining things. And he took things a few steps further, even analyzing album covers and whatnot and saying, well, this means this and this means that. Okay, well, it means this to you, but what's your source on this? Yeah. And there was never any of that. No. Actually, Gary Greenwald did the same thing. It's difficult to remember because that was audio, but there is a part in his presentation where he's showing a lot of album covers and whatnot too. Right. Joe Vieira, he did the same thing and with a lot of the same album covers. Yeah. Like Rush's 2112 is supposed to be about the eradication of Christianity by the year 2112. And there's all of this in the album cover. And of course, back then you're a teenage boy waiting for the rapture to happen. And this whole notion of, oh my God, no more Christians. And like everyone's just going to keep going to hell forever and ever. That was the way I thought about it. And it tainted the way that I looked at a lot of the bands that I liked. Fortunately, I didn't have any Rush albums because I don't know if I could ever really seriously forgive myself for smashing Rush albums. That appreciation came actually a little bit later. So I didn't have any of that. I also didn't have a lot of the classic rock stuff yet. I wasn't into Floyd that much yet. But some ELO didn't survive the day. Oh. And that, I'll tell you, that it still tugs at my heart. Those albums were pristine. Yeah. I had vinyl that was pristine. It was so, I took such good care of most of my albums. I decided to spare a couple of them. I spared the E.T. soundtrack.
Oh, God.
Pretty much anything John Williams. I spared the E.T. soundtrack. I spared all of the Star Wars soundtracks.
Of course.
Anything I think that didn't have words but was still secular, I think was okay. Yeah. I didn't smash any of my classical stuff because why? Yeah. But I had a reasonably good stack of vinyl albums and a huge cache of cassette tapes that just went bye-bye in the course of less than an hour because of all of this. And because of some of the album covers that they had talked about. Now I was once again convinced that I was letting Satan live in my house because I had these albums. Mm. And I gave up secular music for a long time after that, probably about 2 years. Now imagine you're living in the 80s. Okay. Lifetime atheists, imagine you're living in the 80s, okay? And you're about our age. And this was the music that was popular. And such good music came out in the 80s, especially in pop. Such good music came out in the 80s. Now, cut 2 years of it out of your life. You missed Walk Like an Egyptian. You missed all kinds of really good stuff. Walk Like an Egyptian, that one, for whatever reason, that one sticks out in my mind because it was one that one of our other youth leaders liked a lot and would sing a lot out loud and whistle a lot out loud. So I knew some of these songs because they were around, you know what I mean? So even though it was completely ingrained in the culture, I managed to stay away from most of it for a really, really long time. And after a little while, it just occurred to me that it was too big a thing in the culture to just ignore. And most of it really wasn't that bad. I got over the whole satanic thing before college, to be perfectly honest. But I did still go see the Peters Brothers a couple times because, you know, old habits die hard.
Yeah.
And at that point, honestly, I think that it was more entertaining than anything. I don't think that I was really still taking it that seriously. But it was an interesting year and a half there because those two things happened real close together now that I'm thinking about it. Now that I'm thinking about it, they really did happen very, very close to one another. I put this guy's name in all caps. I'm going to spend maybe 1 minute on this. Only because we used to run his show on the radio network that I worked for. And this was a guy whose name, I don't know why I'm talking about him in past tense. He's still out there and he's still a nut job. His name is Bob Larson. Okay. And he had a daily 2-hour call-in radio talk show that aired on Christian radio all over the place and even on some secular radio. Because I'm sure that they thought that it was a hoot. This was the afternoon zoo as opposed to the morning zoo. And believe me, that show was a zoo and it was a train wreck. And we only carried the first hour. There were a lot of stations that only carried the first hour. I was kind of obsessed with Bob Larson for a while there. And when I was working at the radio station, one of my favorite things to do was to pop in a cassette and just keep recording the second hour off the satellite to listen to on the way home. So I got to do that a couple of times. And my God, this guy was such a nut job. Sooner or later, we're going to talk about the radio station and some of the people that I encountered there and how I ended my relationship with Sound of Life Radio. But that's another episode, and I don't want to get too far into that now. But it's relevant because I spent a lot of time as a fill-in announcer at the station. And when I was doing the mid-afternoon, I was responsible for making sure that we pulled in Bob Larson and got our local ads playing and all of that. So I was involved with this. And given the people that I worked with and some of their attitudes and just some of the absolute bizarre things that I saw come out of that station, Bob Larson was still too weird for most of the people there. And eventually his show got pulled. There were a lot of people that liked it, but boy, oh boy, did that show not fit anything else that was happening on that station. It was the most gonzo hour of their broadcast day. And there were plenty of people who liked it. But even I was left wondering sometimes, how long is he going to get away with this until we, as a network, pull the plug on him? Well, I don't remember precisely when it was. I think it was after I left for college that they finally decided that they weren't going to be running his stuff anymore. And I remember talking to the guy who was the general manager when I was hired there. And it had something to do with a statement that he made that was just a little bit too over the top for everybody's taste. And everyone who had been listening at the station that day said the same thing at once. Okay, that's it. This is the last day.
Yeah.
But his biggest thing was demonic possession. And he spent insane amounts of time on supernatural topics, but then tried to tie them in as all being legit. He would have obvious plants calling in who claimed to be Wiccans, who claimed to be involved in the occult, who claimed to have taken part in a bunch of rituals and whatnot. I'm reasonably certain that they were mostly or all plants. When I can even remember listening to some of these calls and thinking to myself, this sounds really, really rehearsed. It really this does not sound like a normal conversation that would be happening between two people. A little lie becomes a bigger lie, becomes a bigger lie, becomes more lies, becomes more lies, becomes more lies. And that has been Bob Larson's entire career. I'm certain that he started out just tried to make a buck off of evangelical hotbed issues. And he really latched on to the Satanic Panic and ran with it. And he really, he's still out there doing the same thing. Just Google him, Bob Larson. If you don't know who he is, then with all due respect, if you don't know who he is, and you will 5 minutes from now, all I can say is I'm sorry. Because he's a crackpot, and he's been at this for a very long time. So last thing that I can remember with this was kind of the icing on the cake, was the whole thing with Geraldo. And that idiotic special that they did, where they even brought in a bunch of people from the McMartin preschool case, or people they said were part of that. They had a bunch of different groups that they never even got to during that hour. There were people that they never even got to talk to,
right.
Which makes me wonder if they even had anything to say, or if he was just trying to make it look like this is such a big issue and such a big problem. We can't fit all of this into an hour. So sorry, guys. He interviewed Sean Sellers. There was a lot going on. You can find it on YouTube. The entire thing is still on YouTube. I don't know how many times I watched this when I was a kid too, and really just believed all of it wholeheartedly because it followed in such lockstep with everything that Gary Greenwald had to say, everything that the Peters brothers had to say. And you saw real Satanists. You saw Michael Aquino from the Temple of Set, who was the head of that organization until fairly recently, I think. We had Zena LaVey, who was the daughter of Anton LaVey. And there was credibility because people knew, anyone who was part of that, the satanic subculture, and at least knew who these people were. And a lot of people knew who Anton LaVey was. A lot of people knew about the Satanic Bible. So having Zena LaVey there lent credibility to it. And I believe most of it at that point too, because now I've seen this stuff from multiple sources. And he talked about other things too, like Richard Ramirez and other serial killers that claimed satanic influence. He did talk to Sean Sellers, cut him right off when he started witnessing, which at the time pissed me off. But now it's like, yeah, you tell him. You tell him. Just tell him to shut up. But Sean Sellers and Bob Larson were real tight too, because Sean Sellers would call Bob Larson's show from time to time.
Yeah.
And those shows were the ones that were listened to quite a bit. And I got to tell you, I liked Sean Sellers back in the day, back when I still thought like he did. But listening to some of his interviews and just hearing what was described earlier, that arrogance to the very end, was very, very true. But it was also the mindset.
Yeah.
Obviously, this was someone who was not right in the head. And sorry, but it's very, very easy for someone to pick up the gospel and roll with it when they aren't right in the head. And that was Sean Sellers. But anything you want to add before we wrap this up? We're going long like we normally do, but I really wanted to get that part about Procter and Gamble out because it was a huge part of my religious trauma when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Not so big of a problem now. I've gotten past most of it, but it really, really, really freaked me. And there were other things about this too that we're going long like we always do. So I'm going to kind of leave it there. I'm going to let my co-host say a little something, and then I'm going to do my little thing at the end where I talk to you.
Well, the Procter and Gamble thing didn't affect me much. I think it was before I was in that mindset, so it didn't really affect me as much. I thought it was kind of silly. I accepted the explanation they made that the 13 stars stood for the 13 colonies and all that. The thing that freaked me out, the music stuff freaked me out.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we watched a few videos about the Satan in rock music thing. I think that was actually the name of the documentary we listened to, the Satan of rock music or something like that.
Are we talking about the Greenwald stuff or something else?
I'm not sure which one it was. There were so many copycats.
If it was an audio thing, if we were like in the car and listening, that was Gary Greenwald.
No, it was a video.
Oh, okay. But it was all the same stuff. It was always the same foundation.
All the same stuff. All the same, like, all the same songs
Yeah.
and all the same weird covers of bands I'd never heard of. That was the funny part, is like they thought, I don't know where these bands came from, but some of them, like, I have never heard of this band, and I'm not sure if this is a real band.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of like, who is this? I
Well,
don't
they
know.
were real bands, but
Yeah.
sometimes they found more obscure examples. But if they could latch onto something that was really like crystal clear, like there's no way you're not going to hear at least this word, they
Yeah.
can latch all kinds of stuff onto that.
Yeah.
It's like, this sounds like they're saying this, so let's capitalize on it. What else do you hear in here?
Yeah.
Oh, that sort of thing.
The album covers freaked me out more than the songs did, because I'm visual. If I see a thing and it bothers me, that's what I'm going to see every time I close my eyes.
Oh, I've seen that with you. There
I
was that
know.
one poster.
Oh,
I
yeah.
forget what it was called.
It was called
Birth Pangs.
Birth Pangs.
Now, if you Google that, I'm pretty sure you can still find the picture.
Yes.
It's a really, really freaky, kind of psychedelic
But
picture.
the guy, I actually found the guy who painted it, I found his deviant art, which I don't think he really knew how to use at the time, but he posted like that one and a couple other ones because I was curious. And, you know, he could explain the whole thing and all of the symbolism and stuff. But back then I just thought it was like, this looks like a nightmare to me. This looks like what I see in my nightmares.
Yeah,
So it
yeah.
freaked me.
Yeah, there was something, I remember you talking about that and saying something about there was something wrong with the cross, and crosses need to be correct.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. But what was it? The one where it's the cross with the question mark?
Yeah, something like that. It was really weird. And the other thing that affected me was that they were really coming down hard on the occult. I enjoyed mostly the aesthetics. I mean, I was 14 and I got into this stuff when I was like 12. And most of it was the fascination with astrology and the occult and fortune telling mostly. And I liked the crystals. I liked the imagery. I was fascinated with tarot cards. All of those things. But they would ask me about my testimony. The better a testimony you had,
The more friends you were going to have.
of course.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was like they made me, it was like the more they talked to me about it, the more they made me link it to other things, other feelings, made everything extremely negative. I threw out everything. I threw out all of my
Sounds
things.
familiar.
I threw out, like, I had a really thick, loose leaf notebook of stuff I'd copied out of books.
It was basically your book of shadows.
Basically,
Yeah.
it was 3 inches thick.
Yeah.
It was all handwritten.
That's a book of shadows.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I threw it out because I was terrified. And it took me a long time to come back to it.
Well,
I
yeah.
mean,
Decades.
right.
It was all still kind of centered in your head.
Right.
And there were things that I had learned and seen about Wicca and about the occult religions that always kind of they stayed in my head too.
Yeah.
So even when I was in college, there were little murmurings of this, but I didn't dare explore any of it.
Oh, no.
I didn't dare to explore any of it.
Right.
So anything else
and
on that?
it was never a problem when I was an Episcopal because they understood that, you can be a Christian and still be interested in things like that.
Right.
But no, when I got saved, it was all a big no-no. And it was like I had to shut off a part of my creativity in order to be a part of this.
Yeah.
And not having that, it was always like all I wanted was to do it again. All I wanted was to be that.
Just to be anything, because you're not allowed to
No.
be anything. It is no longer I that liveth, but Christ which liveth within me.
Yeah,
You're not allowed to be anything. You're supposed to see yourself as nothing.
right. It's like you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, but you're never taught to love yourself in the first place.
I still have a huge problem with that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm much, much quicker to criticize myself than I am to give myself a break.
Right.
But, I'll get into more of this later down the road when it's a little bit more appropriate. But even now, my brain does this thing where it separates itself and has different personas for different parts of my psyche. I don't have multiple personalities. I have one personality that has all these different facets that still put on different faces and different hats at different times. And it's almost like I've got something external talking to me, but I know that it's me. I know that it's me. It's just that my brain has been taught to think this way for so long that it helps to wrangle in certain thoughts, certain concepts, gets me to agree with myself a little bit more often when I'm right.
I think that being in Wicca actually helped me to take a look at all of these things. And I was able to experience all of the things I wanted to experience as a teenager.
Brought everything that I was curious about right out into solid reality. And I spent a few years in that and got everything out of it that I needed to get out of it.
Yep.
And then realized that I didn't need any of it.
Right.
And that was pretty much,
that was
it with you too, wasn't it?
Yeah,
more
pretty
or less?
much. I mean, we have always had this strange parallel spiritual journey.
It has really amazed me how the two of us have stayed kind of on the same wavelength.
Right.
For this whole time. The changes that we have gone through, that our relationship has gone through over the years, should have killed it years ago.
Yeah.
I have no idea what it is that keeps us going, but it's always been that way. We've always kind of evolved at the same time, where you've been a little bit behind me. And you know what? Someone would argue, okay, well, she's just sort of following her husband. Well, you know what? Maybe that's somewhat true, but every decision about everything that you've ever done with your spiritual life has been yours. It hasn't had nothing to do with me. I never told you to leave the Episcopal Church.
Nope.
You stayed there longer than I did, and I was fine with it.
Yeah.
And so that's always been our dynamic. But there have been so many other things and recent things that, a lot of other couples, a lot of this shit would just kill the relationship.
Right.
And we're still here. We're like the Energizer fucking bunny of relationships. And we're still here 30 years later, almost practically to the day, the end of this year.
Yeah.
It's going to be, oh no, hold on. End of last year.
End of
and
last
the last year was 30 years.
Yes, it was.
And yeah, we even talked about that, I think, in the first episode too.
Yeah.
So yeah, 30 years and counting.
Yes.
We've been at this. And we've changed and evolved right around each other and then with each other.
Yeah.
And it's really been a cool journey, and it's going to continue to be. And I don't want to go into a real heavy close with this. This is normally when I turn around and talk to the audience. I'm just going to be very, very brief about this and tell you, you know what? Anything that scared you back in the day about this, and especially people who are around our age, you're like mid 40s to early 50s, and you remember this well. This was part of your adolescence the same way that it was mine and Shelle's. If a lot of this stuff freaked you out to the point where you at least had a few fleeting scary thoughts about it along the way, or you did some things like smashing your entire record collection because you believed in backward masking, this is why we do this show, and we do it the way that we do it, because I like the whole blunt force honesty and transparency angle that we take with this, because if I was the listener, it would confirm for me beyond the shadow of a doubt that there are other people out there that went through this stuff and dealt with it the same way. Don't be ashamed of anything that happened back then, because where your brain was then, it was inevitable that you were going to receive this information this way. There was no way that you were going to escape it. And there was no way that you were going to just dismiss it on any rational terms. You were not being taught to think that way. You were being taught to think about things like the rapture and the end times and all these awful things that, for whatever reason, this gospel of peace wants you to believe in. And this cataclysmic end of your world and everything about it, it stands to reason that when you hear stuff about Satan in rock music and backward masking and all of the terrible things that you heard about in the early 80s, it really is good fodder for all of the end times freaks to say, see that? You are now seeing the spirit of Antichrist in this world. And I heard that a lot in the 80s too. There was so much talk about the rapture being like days away because of all this stuff that was happening. And a lot of it got tied in to the Satanic Panic. Although I will admit that there weren't a whole lot of throwbacks. It's just that it laid a really, really good foundation, especially in the evangelical mind, because now you're thinking about all of these things that are not just impacting the church, they're impacting society. And it lends credibility to your belief that the end is near, that the spirit of Antichrist is in the world, and that the Antichrist could be alive right now. It all ties in. So if your thinking got skewed off into this tangent where now you're looking for demons under rocks and throwing away your ivory soap because you're washing your face with Satan, understand that you're in good company and that hopefully you know just a little bit better now. Because things like this are designed to fade over time. They're supposed to be fads. They're supposed to shock you into certain actions that are going to take you a certain direction for a certain distance and just sort of leave you off there. And the Satanic Panic was one of those things, and the way that particularly evangelicals used it, most notably with the backward masking part of it. They picked that up and really ran with it. And it's just another way that they have of using fear to keep you in control. And it was just too easy. And it was just too available. And there was a lot of capitalizing on it. So if you still have memories, like I do, of some of the crazy shit that you did or thought or were afraid of, understand that you are in very good company. And the fact that you've gotten past it says that you are capable of getting completely and totally unbound on your own. And that's why we're here, to help you along your way, to help you find your path, and to help you understand that plenty of other people have gone through a lot of these same things. They remember the same things. And even if we're talking about differences of generations, there are always those things that people fixate on that keep them tethered to their religion. Don't think that this is something that was unique to you or that you got duped into anything. You were part of a collective mindset that was predisposed to just swallow all of this shit hook, line, and sinker. And the fact that you did doesn't make you stupid, gullible, naive, or anything else. It just has to do with the fact that that was where your thoughts were being focused at the time. And it's time to forgive yourself for smashing all those albums or going crazy because you had ivory soap in your house. It's time to stop worrying about that and maybe sort of kind of look back on the sheer silliness of it and forgive yourself for it, because it's just one more way that you're going to help yourself get past all of this crazy and once and for all find yourself unbound. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Unbound. Show topics are chosen based on their timeliness, relevance, and social impact. Have suggestions for future topics? Email us at unbound.podcast.network@gmail.com with all your comments and feedback. Please don't forget to like, share, and throw a few 5-star ratings our way, and follow us on all major social platforms. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Links to our social pages, as well as a full list of cited sources in today's episode, are listed in the show notes, available at our website, getunbound.org. That's get-unbound.org. If you value this resource and would like to see it continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon at the link in the show description. And be sure to check for new updates every Sunday when we'll come together again and take one more step toward getting and staying unbound.